Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates played with dolls, she was taking apart radios in her father's garage. While they painted their nails, she was learning to change oil in pickup trucks. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had served 3 tours in Vietnam and came home with stories that made Sarah's eyes light up with curiosity, rather than fear. "The military teaches you things you can't learn anywhere else, mija," he would tell her while they worked on engines together. "It teaches you that you're stronger than you think you are." Sarah's mother, Elena, worried about her daughter's fascination with her father's war stories. She would watch Sarah hanging on every word when Miguel talked about his time overseas, and she could see something burning in her daughter's eyes that made her nervous. Elena had married a soldier and knew the cost of that life. She had spent countless nights wondering if Miguel would come home, and she didn't want that same worry for her daughter. But Sarah was drawn to something bigger than her small town could offer. She excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science. Her teachers encouraged her to pursue engineering. But Sarah had already made up her mind about her future. On her 18th birthday, she walked into the Army recruiting office in downtown Austin and signed her enlistment papers. Miguel was proud but worried. Elena cried for 3 days straight. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was everything Sarah had imagined and more. The physical challenges pushed her body to its limits, but her mind soared. She discovered she had a natural talent for explosives and demolition work. Her instructors noticed her steady hands and sharp focus under pressure. While other recruits struggled with the technical aspects of bomb disposal, Sarah seemed to understand the intricate dance between life and death that came with diffusing explosives. After completing her advanced individual training in explosive ordnance disposal, Sarah was assigned to the 52nd Ordnance Group. She was one of only 3 women in her unit, and she quickly learned that proving herself would be an ongoing battle. Some of her male colleagues accepted her based on her skills, but others made it clear they thought women had no place in such dangerous work. Staff Sergeant James Kowalski was one of those who questioned her presence. During training exercises, he would deliberately give her the most difficult scenarios, hoping she would fail and transfer to a different military occupation. Instead, Sarah thrived under the pressure. She approached each explosive device with methodical precision, earning the respect of her team members one diffused bomb at a time. "Martinez doesn't rattle," said Sergeant First Class David Chen, who became Sarah's closest friend in the unit. "I've seen grown men shake when they're dealing with IEDs, but she's steady as a rock. It's like she was born for this work." Sarah's first deployment came 18 months after enlisting. The unit received orders to deploy to Afghanistan, specifically to the volatile Kandahar province. The Taliban had been increasing their use of improvised explosive devices, and the casualty rates among coalition forces were climbing. Sarah's EOD team would be responsible for clearing roads, investigating suspected bomb sites, and training Afghan forces in basic explosive recognition. The reality of Afghanistan hit Sarah the moment she stepped off the transport plane at Kandahar airfield. The heat was overwhelming. Even at 6 in the morning, the landscape stretched endlessly in shades of brown and tan, broken only by the occasional green of irrigated fields. The air smelled of dust, diesel fuel, and something else she couldn't quite identify but later learned was the constant undercurrent of fear that permeated everything in a war zone. Her first month in country was relatively quiet. Sarah's team conducted routine patrols, checking roads for suspicious objects, and training with Afghan National Army engineers. She wrote long emails to her parents, describing the children who would wave at their convoys and the surprising beauty of the sunset over the Hindu Kush Mountains. Everything changed on a Tuesday in October. Sarah's team received an urgent call to investigate a suspected IED on Highway 1, the main road connecting Kandahar to Kabul. Intelligence reports suggested that Taliban fighters had planted multiple devices along a 3-mile stretch of highway, effectively cutting off supply convoys to forward operating bases. The convoy consisted of 4 vehicles: 2 Humvees for security, an MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, carrying Sarah's EOD team, and a support truck with additional equipment. As they approached the suspected area, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that always preceded dangerous missions. "Remember, we take this slow and methodical," said Sergeant First Class Chen over the radio. Sarah, you're on point for the first device. Rodriguez, you're backing her up. Kowalski, you maintain overwatch. The first IED was exactly where intelligence had predicted. Sarah approached the suspicious mound of dirt beside the road wearing her heavy bomb suit, the protective gear that made her look like an astronaut but felt like a sauna in the Afghan heat. Through her helmet's visor, she could see the telltale signs. Recently disturbed Earth, a small antenna poking through the surface, and the faint outline of a pressure plate. Working carefully with her robotic tools, Sarah began the delicate process of exposing the device without triggering its detonation. The bomb was more sophisticated than usual, with multiple redundant triggers designed to catch EOD technicians who successfully bypassed the primary activation mechanism. It took her 45 minutes to safely disarm and remove the explosive components. Outstanding work, Martinez. Chen's voice crackled through her headset. That's device number 1. Intel says there are at least 3 more ahead. The second IED proved even more challenging. Taliban bomb makers had hidden it inside the carcass of a dead goat beside the road, disguising the metal components among the animal's bones. The smell was overwhelming, even through Sarah's protective equipment. She fought against her gag reflex while carefully extracting the explosive device, aware that one wrong move could not only kill her, but also eliminate the evidence needed to understand the enemy's bomb-making techniques. It was while she was working on the third device that everything went wrong. Sarah had identified what appeared to be a simple pressure plate IED buried beneath a pile of rocks. She followed standard procedures, using her robot to clear away debris and expose the bomb's trigger mechanism. But as she carefully manipulated the robotic arms to disconnect the detonation cord, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There was a second device. The Taliban had daisy-chained 2 bombs together, with the second one designed to explode when EOD technicians attempted to disarm the first. It was a tactic they had started using to specifically target bomb disposal experts. And Sarah realized she was looking at her own death, unless she could figure out how to safely separate the 2 devices. Chen, I've got a problem here, she radioed back to her team. We're dealing with a complex device. 2 charges, interconnected. I need everybody to fall back to minimum safe distance. Negative, Martinez. You fall back too. We'll call for an airstrike and destroy both devices. Can't do that, Sergeant. There's a school about 200 meters to the east. If we detonate these charges, the shrapnel will reach the building. I can see kids playing in the courtyard. Sarah stared at the bombs through her visor, calculating angles and blast patterns in her head. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the children's morning recess ended and they returned to their classrooms, which would actually put them in greater danger from an airstrike than from an accidental detonation of the IEDs. The next few minutes stretched into eternity. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, guided by 18 months of training and an intuitive understanding of explosive devices that her instructors had recognized from her first day in EOD school. She carefully traced the connection between the 2 bombs, identifying the specific wire that linked their detonation sequences. The wire was booby-trapped. Cutting it would trigger both devices simultaneously. But Sarah noticed something else. A small mercury switch attached to the second bomb's timer mechanism. If she could very carefully rotate the device exactly 90 degrees counterclockwise, the mercury would shift away from the electrical contacts and break the circuit between the 2 bombs. The rotation had to be perfect. Too little, and the circuit would remain active. Too much, and she would trigger a tilt switch backup mechanism that would detonate both charges immediately. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, said a quick prayer to whatever deity might be watching over EOD technicians, and began the most delicate operation of her young career. Through the robotic controls, she gripped the second device and began to rotate it with movements so small they were barely perceptible. 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees. At 75 degrees, the device shifted slightly in the sandy soil, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. But the movement had actually helped, settling the bomb into a more stable position for the final rotation. 80 degrees, 85 degrees, 90 degrees. The circuit light on Sarah's diagnostic equipment went dark. The connection between the 2 bombs was broken. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah safely disarmed both devices, rendering them harmless and preserving them for intelligence analysis. When she finally walked back to her team, she was soaked in sweat and shaking from the adrenaline crash that always followed high-stress operations. "How did you know to rotate the second device?" asked Rodriguez, the junior member of their EOD team. "I didn't know," Sarah admitted. "I just hoped." That evening, as Sarah sat in her small bunk at the forward operating base, she received an email from her father. Miguel had somehow heard about the day's mission through military communication networks, and his message was brief but meaningful. "Mija, your grandmother always said that angels watch over people who protect children. I think she was right. Stay safe and come home to us." Sarah would complete 7 more months in Afghanistan, successfully disarming over 200 explosive devices and training dozens of Afghan engineers in bomb disposal techniques. She earned commendations for her technical expertise and calm performance under pressure. Her commanding officers wrote evaluation reports that described her as one of the most naturally gifted EOD technicians they had ever observed. But it was the incident with the daisy-chained bombs that would later come back to haunt her. During a mission debrief, Staff Sergeant Kowalski had questioned whether Sarah had really identified the second device as quickly as she claimed, or whether she had simply gotten lucky. His report suggested that her success might have been due more to fortune than skill, and this assessment would later find its way into her permanent military record. Sarah didn't know about Kowalski's doubts at the time. She was too focused on the job, too committed to protecting her fellow soldiers and the Afghan civilians caught in the crossfire of a war they hadn't chosen. Every bomb she defused was a small victory against an enemy that used terror as a weapon against innocent people. As her deployment wound down, Sarah began thinking about her future in the military. She loved the technical challenges of EOD work, but she was also aware that the constant stress was taking a toll on her body and mind. She had seen friends struggle with the transition back to civilian life, and she wondered if she would face similar challenges. The answer to that question would come sooner than she expected, and in a way that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, truth, and the price of serving her country. Sarah's convoy was 3 weeks away from the end of their deployment when they received what should have been a routine call to investigate a suspected IED near a remote village in Helmand Province. Intelligence reports suggested that Taliban fighters had placed a single device along a supply route used by Afghan security forces. The mission seemed straightforward: locate the bomb, disarm it, and return to base. Sarah had performed similar operations dozens of times without incident. But as their convoy approached the target area, she felt an uneasiness that she couldn't quite explain. Something about the intelligence report bothered her, though she couldn't put her finger on what seemed wrong. The feeling in her stomach would prove to be prophetic. This mission would change everything about Sarah's life, setting in motion events that would eventually bring her face to face with a colonel who would question everything she had sacrificed for her country. The convoy rolled through the Afghan countryside as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, running through the mental checklist that had become second nature after hundreds of similar missions. Her bomb suit was properly fitted, her diagnostic tools were functioning correctly, and her radio communication with the team was clear. But something still felt wrong. As they approached the coordinates provided by intelligence, Sarah noticed that the area was unusually quiet. Normally, there would be some signs of local activity: children playing, farmers working in fields, or vendors moving along the roads. This stretch of highway was completely deserted, which could mean either that locals had been warned away from a dangerous area, or that something else entirely was happening. "Chen, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Sarah spoke into her radio as she scanned the landscape through her vehicle's armored windows. "You mean the complete absence of any human activity?" "Yeah, I noticed that too. Could be they know about the IED and are staying clear." Staff Sergeant Kowalski's voice cut across the radio channel. "Or it could be that our intelligence is wrong, and we're driving into something bigger than a single roadside bomb. I suggest we call back to base for updated information before proceeding." Sarah appreciated Kowalski's caution, even though she knew he still harbored doubts about her abilities. Over the months of deployment, their professional relationship had improved, though she sensed he was still waiting for her to make a significant mistake that would validate his skepticism about women in combat roles. The convoy commander decided to proceed with extreme caution. They established a perimeter at the suspected IED location and began the careful process of visual reconnaissance. Using binoculars and telescopic cameras, Sarah's team studied the area where intelligence reported the buried explosive device. What they found was both more and less than expected. There was indeed a suspicious mound of earth beside the road, exactly where the intelligence report had predicted. But Sarah's experienced eyes detected something that immediately raised alarm bells. The mound was too obvious, too perfectly positioned to be a typical Taliban IED placement. In her 18 months of combat experience, Sarah had learned that effective insurgent bomb makers were masters of camouflage. They hid their devices in ways that made them nearly impossible to detect until it was too late. "This doesn't look right," Sarah reported to Chen. "The placement is too obvious. It's almost like they want us to find it." "Could be poor workmanship," Rodriguez suggested over the radio. "Maybe we're dealing with an inexperienced bomb maker." Sarah continued studying the scene through her scope. Her instincts, honed by months of life or death decisions, were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. "I think this is a decoy," she announced to her team. "The real threat is somewhere else." Kowalski's voice carried a note of irritation. "Martinez, we have solid intelligence on this target. You can't just ignore confirmed information because you have a feeling something is wrong. It's not just a feeling, Sergeant. Look at the placement angle. Look at how recent the soil disturbance appears to be. This was placed within the last 24 hours, but our intelligence is 3 days old. Either someone replaced an older device with a new one, or this is deliberately meant to draw our attention." Chen studied the area through his own binoculars before responding. "What are you thinking, Sarah?" "I'm thinking the real IED is somewhere else, probably positioned to target us while we're focused on the decoy." Classic misdirection tactic. We approach the obvious device, and the real bomb takes out our entire team. The debate that followed would be reconstructed later from radio transcripts and survivor testimony. Kowalski argued for following standard procedure. Approach the confirmed target. Determine whether it was an actual explosive device, and proceed accordingly. Sarah advocated for a more comprehensive search of the area before committing to investigating the obvious target. Chen found himself caught between conflicting assessments from 2 experienced team members. He ultimately decided on a compromise approach. They would conduct a broader area search while maintaining visual surveillance on the suspected decoy device. This decision saved their lives. Sarah's systematic search of the surrounding area revealed what she had suspected. A second, much more sophisticated IED buried 50 meters away from the obvious decoy. This device was expertly camouflaged and positioned to target vehicles that stopped to investigate the first bomb. The Taliban had correctly anticipated that coalition forces would establish a security perimeter around suspected explosive devices, and they had positioned their real weapon to strike within that predictable pattern. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Chen radioed, as Sarah identified the second device. "If we had followed standard procedure, we would have parked right on top of this thing." The real device was a masterwork of insurgent engineering. The Taliban bomb makers had constructed a sophisticated pressure-triggered explosive with multiple redundant systems designed to prevent defusal attempts. The bomb contained enough explosive material to destroy several vehicles and kill everyone within a 100-meter radius. Sarah approached the device with the methodical care that had become her trademark. Through her bomb suit's visor, she could see the intricate network of wires, circuits, and backup triggers that made this device particularly dangerous. The bomb makers had incorporated anti-tampering measures specifically designed to kill EOD technicians. For the next hour, Sarah worked with robotic precision to map the device's trigger mechanisms. She identified 3 separate detonation pathways: a primary pressure trigger, a secondary motion sensor, and a tertiary timer system designed to explode the bomb if disarming attempts took longer than a predetermined period. "This is incredibly sophisticated work," she reported to her team. "Whoever built this device has extensive technical training. We're not dealing with typical improvised explosives here. The disarming process required Sarah to simultaneously neutralize all three trigger systems without activating any of the device's anti-tampering measures. She began with the timer mechanism, carefully tracing circuits to identify which wires controlled the countdown sequence. Using her robotic tools, she made precise cuts that disabled the timer without triggering backup systems. Next came the motion sensor, a delicate accelerometer that would detonate the bomb if the device was moved even slightly. Sarah had to freeze the sensor's position by injecting liquid nitrogen into its housing, essentially stopping the mechanism's ability to detect movement. The pressure trigger proved most challenging. The Taliban engineers had designed it to activate not only if someone stepped on the device, but also if the weight distribution around the bomb changed significantly. This meant that even removing soil from above the explosive could trigger detonation. Sarah solved this problem through a technique she had developed during her deployment. She gradually replaced the weight of removed soil with precisely measured sandbags, maintaining constant pressure on the trigger mechanism while exposing the components she needed to access. 3 hours after beginning her work, Sarah successfully rendered the device safe. The bomb contained over 40 pounds of high-grade explosives, enough to crater the highway and kill anyone within the blast radius. As Sarah finished documenting the device for intelligence analysis, she felt the satisfaction that always came with successfully protecting her fellow soldiers. This had been one of her most challenging cases, requiring innovative techniques and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. She was packing her equipment when the world exploded around her. The Taliban had prepared one final surprise: a third explosive device, remotely triggered and positioned to target EOD teams after they completed their work on the primary bombs. This device had been buried months earlier and disguised so perfectly that even Sarah's systematic search had missed it. The blast occurred 15 meters from Sarah's position, close enough to be deadly but far enough away that her bomb suit absorbed much of the impact. The explosion threw her 20 feet through the air, slamming her into the rocky ground with devastating force. Sarah's first sensation was silence. The explosion had temporarily deafened her, and she found herself lying on her back, staring at the Afghan sky through her cracked visor. She tried to move but discovered that her left arm wasn't responding to commands from her brain. Then the pain hit. Shrapnel from the bomb had found gaps in her protective equipment, driving metal fragments into her left shoulder, chest, and leg. The largest piece, a jagged chunk of steel from the bomb's casing, had penetrated her shoulder just above her heart, missing major arteries by millimeters. Blood was pooling beneath her bomb suit, and Sarah realized with clinical detachment that she was probably going to die in a remote Afghan valley 3 weeks before her scheduled return home. Chen's voice reached her through the haze of pain and shock. "Martinez. Sarah, can you hear me?" She tried to respond but found that speaking required more effort than she could manage. Everything seemed to be happening very slowly, as if she were watching events unfold underwater. The next few hours passed in fragments. Sarah remembered being loaded into a medical evacuation helicopter, the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades mixing with the concerned voices of medics working to stabilize her condition. She remembered the antiseptic smell of the military hospital at Bagram Airfield, and the gentle voice of an army nurse telling her that she was going to be fine. Recovery was longer and more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The shrapnel had caused significant damage to Sarah's left shoulder, requiring multiple surgeries to repair torn muscles and remove metal fragments. Some pieces were too close to vital organs to be safely extracted and would remain in her body permanently. The physical scars were extensive but not disfiguring. However, the psychological impact was more complex. Sarah found herself reliving the explosion in dreams, jolting awake with the taste of dust and blood in her mouth. She had survived an experience that killed many soldiers, and the randomness of her survival troubled her more than she expected. During her recovery, Sarah learned that her quick thinking in identifying the decoy device had saved the lives of her entire team. If they had followed standard procedure and established a security perimeter around the obvious target, all 6 members of the EOD unit would have been killed by the second device. Military investigators concluded that Sarah's tactical analysis had been exceptional, and her disarming techniques had been flawless. The third device that wounded her had been emplaced months earlier as part of a complex ambush system designed to target coalition forces over an extended period. Colonel Marcus Webb, the investigating officer, interviewed Sarah 3 times during her hospital stay. His questions focused on her decision-making process and her technical procedures for disarming the sophisticated device. Webb seemed particularly interested in understanding how a relatively junior soldier had developed such advanced tactical instincts. Specialist Martinez, Webb said during their final interview, "Your actions during this incident demonstrate exceptional courage and technical expertise. However, some questions have been raised about the accuracy of your initial reports." Sarah was confused by this statement. "What questions, sir?" Staff Sergeant Kowalski has suggested that your initial assessment of the situation may have been influenced more by intuition than by solid tactical analysis. He believes that your identification of the decoy device may have been fortunate rather than skillful. Webb continued, "Additionally, there are questions about whether you actually identified 3 separate trigger systems in the primary device, or whether your reports have been embellished to make your technical work appear more impressive than it actually was." Sarah stared at the colonel in stunned silence. She was being accused of exaggerating her own heroism, of fabricating details about a mission that had nearly cost her life. "Sir, everything in my reports is accurate. The device had 3 trigger systems, exactly as I described. My team members can verify the technical details of my disarming procedures." Webb's expression remained neutral. "Your team members were positioned at safe distances during your work. They cannot verify the specific technical details of what you encountered." The implication was clear. Webb believed that Sarah might have invented or exaggerated details of her heroic actions to enhance her military reputation. The accusation was particularly painful because it questioned not only her honesty but also her professional competence. Sarah would carry this doubt with her through months of physical therapy and psychological counseling. Even as her body healed and she prepared to return to duty, the question of whether her superiors believed her story continued to haunt her. She didn't know that Colonel Webb had been influenced by a culture within the military that often questioned women's accounts of combat experiences. She didn't know that Webb had a documented history of skepticism regarding female soldiers' capabilities in high-stress situations. Sarah only knew that her honesty and competence were being questioned by people who had never defused a bomb under enemy fire. The seeds of confrontation were planted during those hospital interviews. Sarah returned to duty with commendations for heroism and technical expertise, but also with the knowledge that some people in positions of authority doubted her credibility. She would carry both the physical and emotional scars of her Afghanistan experience for years to come. The shrapnel wounds would heal but leave permanent marks on her skin, visible reminders of a day when her skills and courage had saved lives while nearly costing her own. And eventually, she would face another colonel whose skepticism about her story would force her to reveal those scars in a moment that would change everything about how people understood her service to her country. 5 years after her medical evacuation from Afghanistan, Sarah Martinez stood in the hallway outside Colonel James Harrison's office at Fort Hood, Texas. She wore her dress uniform with the precision that had become second nature during her decade of military service. The Bronze Star Medal on her chest caught the fluorescent light, along with the Purple Heart she had earned that day in Helmand Province. Sarah was now a staff sergeant and had spent the last 3 years training new explosive ordnance disposal specialists. Her technical expertise and combat experience made her one of the most sought-after instructors in the EOD community. Young soldiers who learned under her guidance often spoke of her calm teaching style and her ability to explain complex procedures in simple terms. But today, Sarah wasn't here as an instructor. She was here because her integrity was being questioned once again. The controversy had started 3 weeks earlier, when Staff Sergeant Kowalski, now stationed at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, had submitted a formal complaint to the Army's Inspector General. In his complaint, Kowalski alleged that Sarah had falsified details of her combat service in order to enhance her military reputation and secure promotions she didn't deserve. Kowalski's complaint was detailed and specific. He claimed that Sarah's reports from Afghanistan contained technical impossibilities and tactical decisions that no competent EOD specialist would have made. According to his analysis, the sophisticated device Sarah claimed to have disarmed couldn't have existed with the trigger systems she described. Furthermore, Kowalski alleged that Sarah's identification of the decoy device had been pure luck rather than skilled analysis, and that her subsequent injuries had been caused by her own tactical errors, rather than an unavoidable enemy action. The complaint had gained attention because Kowalski was now assigned to the Army's Explosive Ordnance Disposal School, where he had access to the most current technical information about improvised explosive devices. His detailed critique of Sarah's combat reports included sophisticated technical arguments that impressed senior officers who lacked combat EOD experience. Colonel Harrison had been assigned to investigate the allegations. His background was in military intelligence, rather than explosive ordnance disposal, which meant he relied heavily on technical experts to help him understand the specifics of EOD procedures. Harrison was 53 years old and had spent most of his career analyzing threats and assessing the reliability of intelligence reports. He had a reputation for thoroughness and skepticism, qualities that made him effective at his job but sometimes led him to question information that didn't fit neat patterns. Sarah knocked on Colonel Harrison's office door at precisely 1,400 hours, as requested in his email. His voice called for her to enter, and she stepped into an office that reflected Harrison's analytical personality. The walls were covered with charts, maps, and technical diagrams. His desk was organized with military precision, every document arranged in perfect alignment. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, please have a seat," Harrison said without looking up from a thick file folder. "I've been reviewing your service record and the allegations that have been brought to my attention." Sarah sat in the chair facing Harrison's desk, maintaining the calm composure that had served her well during countless high-pressure situations. She had been through formal interviews before, and she understood that staying emotionally neutral was crucial to maintaining her credibility. Harrison opened the file and began reading directly from Kowalski's complaint. "According to Staff Sergeant Kowalski, your reports from the October 15th incident contain several technical impossibilities. Specifically, he states that the trigger system you described, combining a pressure plate, motion sensor, and timer mechanism, would be unstable and likely to cause premature detonation. With respect, sir, Staff Sergeant Kowalski wasn't present during my examination of the device. I documented my findings according to standard EOD procedures, and my technical analysis was correct." Harrison looked up from the file for the first time, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of an intelligence analyst examining a suspect. "That brings up an interesting point, Staff Sergeant. Your team members were positioned at safe distances during your work. No one can actually verify the technical details of what you encountered." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. This was the same doubt that had haunted her since Colonel Webb's investigation years earlier. The implication was clear. She was the only person who could verify her own heroic actions, which made her account inherently suspect. "Sir, I documented the device with photographs and detailed technical diagrams. The evidence was submitted as part of my mission report." "Yes, I've seen those documents," Harrison replied, flipping through several pages. "However, the photographs show the device after you had already begun disarming it. Staff Sergeant Kowalski argues that you could have modified the trigger systems during your initial work, then photographed the results to support your subsequent reports." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Harrison was suggesting that she had deliberately sabotaged evidence to make herself appear more heroic. The idea was so outrageous that Sarah struggled to formulate a response. "Sir, that accusation is completely false. I would never compromise evidence from a combat operation. My integrity is not negotiable. I would never compromise evidence from mating." "Sir," Harrison continued reading from the complaint, "Staff Sergeant Kowalski also questions your tactical decision-making during the incident. He argues that an experienced EOD specialist would not have insisted on searching for additional devices based solely on intuitive feelings about the target area. My assessment was based on tactical analysis, not intuition. The placement of the decoy device was inconsistent with typical Taliban tactics, and I recognized indicators that suggested a more complex threat." "Indicators that no one else on your team recognized?" Sarah was beginning to understand that Harrison had already made up his mind about her credibility. Every answer she provided was being interpreted through the lens of suspicion that Kowalski had created with his complaint. "Sir, Different team members have different areas of expertise. My experience with Taliban bomb-making techniques allowed me to recognize patterns that others might have missed. Harrison closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Staff Sergeant Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. The allegations in this complaint are serious, and they raise questions about your fitness for continued service in the EOD community. If these claims are substantiated, you could face disciplinary action, including reduction in rank and possible discharge. The threat was explicit. Sarah's entire military career was being placed in jeopardy because of one person's questions about her combat service. However, Harrison continued, I'm willing to give you an opportunity to respond to these allegations in detail. I want you to walk me through the events of October 15th, step by step, and explain exactly how you made the tactical and technical decisions that led to your team's survival. For the next hour, Sarah provided a methodical account of the mission that had nearly cost her life. She described her initial assessment of the target area, her recognition of the decoy device, her systematic search that revealed the real threat, and her complex disarming procedures. Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but never changing his expression of professional skepticism. When Sarah finished her account, he sat quietly for several minutes, reviewing his notes. Staff Sergeant Martinez, your story is certainly compelling. However, I find myself struggling with some of the same questions that Staff Sergeant Kowalski has raised. The device you described was extraordinarily sophisticated, beyond what we typically see from Taliban bomb makers. Your tactical instincts seem almost too perfect for someone with your level of experience at the time. Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, a mixture of anger and disappointment that she had worked for years to suppress. She had sacrificed her body for her country, had nearly died protecting her fellow soldiers, and now she was being accused of fabricating her service for personal gain. Moreover, Harrison continued, there's the question of physical evidence. You claim to have been severely wounded by shrapnel from the third device, yet you appear to have recovered completely. Staff Sergeant Kowalski suggests that your injuries may have been less severe than reported, which would call into question the entire narrative of your heroic survival. That statement pushed Sarah beyond her carefully maintained emotional control. The implication that she had exaggerated her injuries, that she had somehow faked the months of surgery and rehabilitation, was more insulting than any questioning of her technical competence. Sir, with respect, Staff Sergeant Kowalski was not present during my medical treatment. He has no basis for questioning the severity of my injuries. Then perhaps you could provide some clarification, Harrison said, his voice taking on a prosecutorial tone. If your injuries were as severe as claimed, there would certainly be visible evidence. Shrapnel wounds of the type described in your medical records would leave permanent scarring. Sarah stared at Harrison, realizing that he was essentially calling her a liar to her face. He was suggesting that her Purple Heart was undeserved, that her Bronze Star was fraudulent, and that her entire combat record was built on fabrications. For a moment, Sarah considered simply accepting whatever judgment Harrison reached. She could transfer to a non-combat role, complete her remaining years of service quietly, and retire with her benefits intact. Fighting these allegations would be exhausting and emotionally devastating, regardless of the outcome. But then she thought about the young EOD specialists she was training, soldiers who looked up to her as an example of technical excellence and personal courage. She thought about her parents, who had supported her military career, despite their fears for her safety. Most importantly, she thought about Chen, Rodriguez, and the other team members whose lives she had saved that day in Afghanistan. Those people deserved better than her quiet capitulation to false accusations. Sir, Sarah said, standing up from her chair. You want to see evidence of my injuries? Harrison looked surprised by her sudden movement. Staff Sergeant, please remain seated. You want to see proof that I nearly died serving my country? Sarah's voice was steady, but Harrison could hear the emotion beneath her professional tone. Without waiting for permission, Sarah began unbuttoning her dress uniform jacket. Harrison started to object, but something in Sarah's expression stopped him from speaking. Sarah removed her jacket and carefully folded it before placing it on Harrison's desk. Underneath, she wore the standard Army tan t-shirt that revealed her arms and the base of her neck. The scars were immediately visible. A network of white lines traced across Sarah's left shoulder, where surgeons had worked to repair muscle damage caused by the largest piece of shrapnel. Smaller marks dotted her upper arm where metal fragments had been extracted. Most prominently, a 4-inch surgical scar ran along her collarbone, marking where doctors had removed a piece of the bomb's steel casing that had missed her heart by less than an inch. But it was the small, dark marks that told the real story. 7 pieces of shrapnel remained permanently embedded in Sarah's shoulder and chest, too close to vital organs to be safely removed. The metal fragments were visible beneath her skin as small, dark shadows that would remain with her for the rest of her life. Harrison stared in silence as Sarah turned to show him the scarring on her back, where shrapnel had been extracted from muscles along her spine. The medical work had been skillful, but the evidence of trauma was unmistakable. "This," Sarah said quietly, "is what it looks like when you absorb the blast from 40 pounds of high explosives at 15 meters. This is what it looks like when you spend 4 months learning to use your left arm again, because shrapnel severed muscle connections that took 3 surgeries to repair." She turned back to face Harrison directly. "These scars are what earned me the Purple Heart that Staff Sergeant Kowalski thinks I don't deserve. The Bronze Star that he questions was awarded because my tactical analysis saved the lives of 6 American soldiers who would have died if we had followed standard procedure." Harrison remained silent. His expression transformed from skepticism to something approaching awe. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have carried pieces of that bomb in my body for 5 years. Every time I raise my left arm above my shoulder, I feel the metal fragments shifting inside muscle tissue. Every cold morning, I wake up with pain from scar tissue that will never fully heal." She picked up her uniform jacket and began putting it back on. "But do you know what hurts more than any of those physical reminders? It's sitting in this office and being accused of fabricating my service by people who have never defused a bomb under enemy fire." Harrison finally found his voice. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, I had no idea." "No, sir, you didn't, and neither does Staff Sergeant Kowalski, because you both made assumptions about my credibility without ever asking to see the evidence that I carry with me every day." Sarah finished buttoning her jacket and stood at attention. "Sir, if you have further questions about my service record, I am prepared to answer them, but I will not sit quietly while my integrity is questioned by people who have never experienced combat." The office fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Harrison stared at his desk, seemingly unable to meet Sarah's eyes. When he finally looked up, his expression had completely changed. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, please accept my apologies. I clearly approached this investigation with insufficient understanding of the situation." Harrison opened the complaint file and began making notes. "Based on the evidence you've shown me today, I find Staff Sergeant Kowalski's allegations to be without merit. Your combat record speaks for itself, and the physical evidence of your injuries confirms the accuracy of your service reports." Sarah remained standing at attention, though she could feel some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "I intend to recommend that Staff Sergeant Kowalski face disciplinary action for filing a knowingly false complaint against a fellow soldier. His allegations were clearly motivated by personal bias rather than legitimate concerns about military standards." Harrison stood up from behind his desk, a gesture of respect that acknowledged the injustice of the previous hour. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, you have served your country with exceptional courage and distinction. I regret that you were subjected to this inappropriate questioning of your integrity." Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you, sir." "No, Staff Sergeant, thank you. For your service, for your sacrifice, and for your patience with a foolish old colonel who should have known better." As Sarah left Harrison's office, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the investigation was over, anger that it had been necessary in the first place, and a deep sadness that her service had been questioned by people who should have known better. But she also felt something else: a renewed pride in what she had accomplished during her military career. She had faced death in service to her country, and had survived to train the next generation of soldiers. The scars on her body were not marks of shame but badges of honor, proof that she had been willing to sacrifice everything for her fellow service members. Walking through the corridors of Fort Hood in her dress uniform, Sarah thought about the young EOD specialists who would benefit from the hard-won lessons she had learned in Afghanistan. She thought about the bombs that would be safely disarmed because of the techniques she was teaching, and the American lives that would be saved because of her experience. The accusations against her had been resolved, but the larger questions about how the military treated female combat veterans remained. Sarah knew that other women would face similar challenges, their service questioned, and their credibility doubted by people who had never experienced the realities of modern warfare. She also knew that she would continue fighting those battles, one student at a time, one mission at a time, until the day when a woman's combat record would be accepted on its own merits, rather than subjected to special scrutiny. 3 weeks later, Sarah received official notification that all allegations against her had been dismissed and that Kowalski had been reprimanded for filing a false complaint. Her personnel file was updated to include a commendation for her professional conduct during the investigation. But the real resolution came months later, when one of her former students sent her a message from Afghanistan. Specialist Jennifer Kim had successfully disarmed a complex IED using techniques she had learned in Sarah's classes, potentially saving dozens of lives. "Thank you for teaching me to trust my instincts," Kim wrote. "Your training saved my team today." Sarah read the message 3 times before filing it away with other letters from students who had deployed to combat zones around the world. Each message was a reminder that her service continued through the soldiers she trained, and that her experiences in Afghanistan had value that extended far beyond her own personal sacrifice. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, looking at the scars that had silenced Colonel Harrison's doubts. The marks would fade with time, but they would never completely disappear. They were part of her now, woven into the story of her service and sacrifice. She touched the surgical scar along her collarbone, feeling the metal fragments that remained beneath her skin. These pieces of an Afghan bomb would stay with her forever, physical reminders of a day when her courage and skill had meant the difference between life and death for 6 American soldiers. Sarah Martinez had proven her worth in the crucible of combat, had survived an investigation into her integrity, and had emerged stronger for the experience. Her story was written in the scars on her body and the lives she had saved, both in Afghanistan and in the classroom where she passed on her hard-won knowledge to the next generation. The colonel had questioned her story until one look at her shrapnel scars silenced him completely. But Sarah's real victory wasn't in proving her credibility to skeptical superiors. It was in continuing to serve her country with the same dedication and courage that had defined her from the beginning, regardless of who believed her story and who didn't. Her service spoke for itself, written in metal and flesh, and the grateful words of soldiers who came home alive because of what she had taught them. That was a story that needed no defense, no explanation, and no apology. It was simply the truth, carved permanently into her body and soul.